The bottom line is these drugs are highly efficacious and the market is just huge. The TAM is huge. No pun intended. It's hard to stay away from these puns for obesity drugs. And really, these drugs are still in the very early stages. So it is really hard to overstate the opportunity in the obesity market.
Hello and welcome to Signals by AlphaSense, where we hear thoughtful insights from business leaders, investors, and experts.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to Signals by AlphaSense, and I'm your host, Nick Mazing. Today we welcome Sara Stahl, Director of Research Healthcare at Stream, AlphaSense's Expert Insights solution. If you're not familiar with it, the solution covers a wide range of expert insight services, including an extensive expert interview transcript library, integrated with all other document sets like broker research filings and news inside the AlphaSense platform, alongside with co-services, monthly sector newsletters, and Sara's is great, I love it, webinars, and more. Sara, welcome. And can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your work?
Sure. Nick, thanks so much for having me here. As you said, I am the Director of Research with Stream. That means I'm responsible for generating and curating the expert transcript library as it relates to healthcare interviews. And I have 17 years of sell-side experience in the financial services industry. The last 7 have been covering healthcare. And I've personally conducted hundreds of expert interviews myself. And so I really know the value of doing live interviews, talking with people who work in the industry. You hear things you would not otherwise, I think, deeply think about. And you can hear things that are different than what management is saying or what the consensus view is. And so I really value that first person interview aspect into the research process.
So when we were discussing potential topics for the episode, weight loss drugs were top of mind for both of us. Certainly they're generating a lot of news. It's almost unavoidable. Even if you don't watch TV, there is always a headline with some celebrity every day lost 50 pounds, 30 pounds, 6, and so on. So can you help us dig a little bit deeper into so that we can understand what is behind that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It seems like everybody is talking about these drugs. In fact, one of our Stream experts, an endocrinologist, is saying he is now the most popular guy at any party, that he is just getting inundated with people who are asking him about these drugs. The bottom line is these drugs are highly efficacious. And the market is just huge. The TAM is huge. No pun intended. It's hard to stay away from these puns for obesity drugs. And really, these drugs are still in the very early stages. So it is really hard to overstate the opportunity in the obesity market.
I mean, how big do you think the addressable market is?
Well, it's big. Like you said, these celebrity endorsements for the cosmetic benefits are really grabbing the headlines. Supply shortages are grabbing the headlines. Also, who's going to pay for these drugs? That's grabbing the headlines. But let's not forget, obesity is an epidemic. I mean, it's associated with more than 200 comorbidities, things like heart disease, diabetes, sleep apnea, cancer. Also, just to put some numbers on it, the CDC estimates that 50% of US adults will be obese by 2030. Today, we're in the low 40%. 1975, that percentage was 10%. That's the US. Globally, 1 in 8 people are estimated to be obese by 2030. So you can see how big of a problem this is, and the trajectory on it is huge. And then to underscore how persistent the challenges are with obesity, the standard of care with obesity is diet and exercise. But for most people, any weight that's lost is regained within 12 months. And it's not just because people fall off their diets or they stop exercising. Like, our bodies adjust to weight loss and it becomes more stubborn and more difficult. And so it's a very intractable problem.
So can you tell us a bit more about the drugs themselves? Because these are actually a new type of drugs that have not existed before.
They are a new type of drug. And what's interesting is people know the names of these drugs. People who don't even use them, people who don't necessarily follow healthcare. Like, we hear about Ozempic, we hear about Wegovy. Mounjaro is the new one. So these drugs are all GLP-1 receptor agonists. That's the category. It stands for glucagon-like peptide receptor agonists. Really, just simply put, that just means these drugs, they mimic the GLP-1 gut hormone. And that gut hormone controls our appetite. So there's really kind of two things happening. One, it will reduce your appetite while you're eating. So it will tell your body like you're full sooner. And then it will also empty, these drugs will empty your gut more slowly, your stomach more slowly. So you stay satisfied longer. And those two things together, coupled with like the insulin secretion that it regulates, that helps control blood sugars, very important for diabetes, obviously, put all those things together. And it's been a way that's been very successful at controlling appetite. Now, Ozempic was the first of these drugs to hit the market. And technically, Ozempic, this is Novo Nordisk's GLP-1. The generic name for it is semaglutide. This first came to market for type 2 diabetes, and Ozempic is FDA approved for type 2 diabetes. And that approval happened in 2017. There was a previous generation technology from Novo Nordisk. They were looking for something that had longer duration for type 2 diabetes control and found that with semaglutide and received FDA approval for the drug in 2017 for type 2 diabetes. Now, the weight loss benefit that accompanied this was so meaningful that they applied for FDA approval for obesity and received that in 2021. And the name of that drug is Wegovy. It is the same drug. It's just that Ozempic is the approved drug for type 2 diabetes. Wegovy is for obesity. I will add that the obesity drug does come in higher dosages. So there is a difference, but the drug itself is the same and the mechanism of action is the same. So that's Novo Nordisk's path. The other big player right now is Eli Lilly. Their drug, the one that is approved is Mounjaro, and that's also approved for type 2 diabetes. And they are looking to get FDA approval for the same drug for obesity, and they're hoping to do that by the end of the year. Now, the generic name for this drug is tirzepatide, and this is different than Novo's drug in that it's a double receptor agonist, which means it's affecting two gut hormones, where Ozempic's, Wegovy's is one gut hormone. And the result is they've actually had better efficacy with this double agonist. Just put some numbers on that. Mounjaro, 21% weight loss in their clinical trial versus 15% for Wegovy. And also Mounjaro has shown to be better at reducing blood sugar, so controlling blood sugar. So it's proven to be better. And then similarly, the expectation will be that when it's approved for obesity, that we'll continue to see that improvement. The last thing I just want to say about these GLP-1s is that these drugs are especially helpful to diabetic patients who are obese because insulin itself can cause weight gain. So you're taking insulin to control your diabetes. That leads to insulin resistance. The more you take, your body becomes more resistant. As you become more resistant, you gain more weight. And it's just this cycle you can't really break. And the GLP-1s are breaking that vicious cycle. And that is just an extra benefit for diabetic patients who face multiple comorbidities. This is just a way to break that cycle.
So it goes from, the old standard of care where the weight is regained within 12 months to something that drops you, 15, 20%. That's very impressive, obviously. But what are the downsides?
Downsides. There are downsides. First of all, it's a weekly subcutaneous injection. These are not orals at this point. And for some people are needle phobic. It's also just an unpleasant experience, I would say, for some people to inject themselves. So our dosing is one issue. Loss of lean muscle mass is another, that in the process of losing weight, you can lose this lean muscle mass. And that's obviously important, especially for elderly people, to maintain their lean muscle mass. Here's a really important thing. The weight is regained upon discontinuation of these drugs. That's what's been found. And so really you're going to be on these things for life or a long time. And we don't really know what that looks like. We don't have data that show what does this look like to be on these drugs for a lifetime. And then of course, falling off of them has implications for insurance and that kind of thing. Also, they don't work for some patients. And then side effects. They're gastrointestinal issues. The GI side effects are pretty rough for some people: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. I think these have been well documented. But what's interesting, this is where, just listening to a stream transcript can really drive home points. One of our endocrinologists was saying that even though these side effects are very real, that his patients are more willing to put up with them than would otherwise be the case, because of that weight loss benefit, that they just see the ROI. So there seems to be, at least according to this expert, more willingness to put up with some pretty nasty side effects because of the weight gain benefits.
Now, the surprise popularity of those drugs, given the weight loss benefits, led to supply shortages. Can you discuss those?
Yes, you're absolutely right that these things have taken off like wildfire. Like you said, there's been so much buzz on social media, word of mouth, the celebrities, the visibility of celebrities losing weight has just generated so much demand that has created shortages. And the shortage has been going on since last year. And then in May of this year, Novo Nordisk reduced the supply of Wegovy starter doses. So by limiting the supply of starter doses, that's basically saying they're limiting the number of new patients who can start on Wegovy. And they did that in order to maintain supply for existing users. Because again, once you go off these drugs, you will regain weight. So it's important to continue the drugs. So that's what they've done. And they also dialed back on their marketing. They postponed a national ad campaign. They changed some of the couponing that they were doing to physicians to generate interest. So they've made some changes. Interestingly, the supply issues are even affecting Novo's previous generation drug now. It's not nearly as effective, but just the demand for the whole category has gone nuts. Even things that weren't so attractive before are now, and those drugs are in short supply. So I think that's really interesting. Now, Lilly's got shortages as well, and both Lilly and Novo are expanding their manufacturing capacity to address this. But that's going to take some time, obviously. And I think what's notable is we're seeing these shortages even though insurance coverage is not widespread. So a lot of people are willing to pay out of pocket for these drugs. They're not cheap. The price tag will run you $1,000 a month up to $1,700 a month. And we even have stream experts telling us that people are going to Canada and Mexico to get the drugs. Another stream anecdote that kind of drives home the point about how pervasive the interest is in this. He said one of his colleagues, this is a physician, said, "Hey, my sister's getting married. She needs to drop a few pounds before her wedding. Can we get her some Wegovy?" And he said, "She's not that overweight. She looks great." No, this is not the target population. So people want these drugs and they're willing to go to lengths to get them. This also, interestingly, is giving rise to telehealth companies selling these drugs direct to consumers. And what's really interesting is some of these DTC companies are sponsoring TikTok influencers, and TikTok's actually cracking down on this now. But there are so many companies that are going direct to consumer. They're cropping up everywhere. Companies that are pivoting in order to offer these drugs. And then also compounding pharmacies. That's a way to get these drugs if you can't get your hands on the brands. But some of these very questionable operations, they're attracting regulatory scrutiny. You really want to be careful about using a compounding pharmacy, in my opinion, and in our experts' opinion, for these drugs.
Let's double click on the insurance coverage situation that you just mentioned. What is happening today and what is the outlook?
Yeah, the insurance is really a tough issue. We've got the possibility of when you reduce obesity, of really controlling these very severe comorbid conditions. And then, in the process of doing that, the vision is that we'll lower our overall healthcare spending as people do not need, cardiovascular procedures. They prevent cancers, so many benefits, right? But the short-term cost to cover these drugs is really high. I told you about the price tag, $1,000 to $1,700 a month. And then again, look at the addressable market, and the expenditure is huge. And then think about it. What if your patients stop using it and you've invested all this money in something that isn't going to give you that long-term benefit? And for many people, those GI side effects I talked about are enough for people to stop using them. So I think there's a lot of tension here about how is insurance going to react. Now, Medicare, if we look at government insurance, Medicare does not cover obesity drugs. There is some movement within legislators trying to change that. We'll see what happens. Medicaid, that's a state-by-state issue. About 1/3 of states are covering these drugs with Medicaid. So not a lot of government coverage right now. On the commercial side, this is kind of interesting. Lots of companies have been covering weight loss drugs, because this just wasn't much of their budget before. There just wasn't that much demand. And now they're just getting hit with this huge demand, and they're trying to figure out what to do about it. I think I saw somewhere that Novo weight loss drug prescriptions increased 600% in the first 6 months of this year. Just massive. And so these commercial insurers and employers are trying to figure out what to do. A lot of them are putting in restrictions okay, you will not be eligible for these drugs until you try diet or exercise first, cheaper drugs first, which we know do not work as well. Establishing thresholds for BMI, body mass index. So kind of trying to put in gates before people can go ahead and have at it at these drugs. Interestingly, a Stream expert was talking about how they have patients who have done well enough with these drugs that their BMI has dropped to the point where now insurance isn't covering them. So that's obviously not going to work, because we know if you discontinue these drugs, you're going to regain the weight. So issues, right? Lots of things to work out. The last thing I'll say about this, about employer benefits, the question is, will employers feel pressured to cover these drugs, to retain employees, or to even attract employees? And I think I've seen some surveys that say that, some percentage, a pretty sizable percentage, 40, 50% or something of patients who qualify for these drugs would stay with an employer to maintain the coverage, even if they were unhappy in their job. So there's going to be some pressure coming, I think, from the workforce on this. Here, I said that was the last thing I was going to say. There's one last thing I want to say on this. These drug companies are very motivated to figure out how to link obesity to comorbid conditions in their studies. So, for instance, we've got studies underway that are looking at the connection between the obesity drugs and cardiovascular disease, the obesity drugs and fatty liver disease. And if we can demonstrate improvements in these comorbid conditions, the belief is that it will be much easier for insurance to cover these things. Just an interesting Stream anecdote here about fatty liver disease is that one of the Stream experts was explaining how there are patients who have fatty liver disease and who are not necessarily obese. And while this is a relatively small group compared to the overall obese population, it's still another group to which these drugs would apply. So we're expanding kind of the market even further with another group that has fatty liver disease is not necessarily obese. So just kind of an interesting side note. But I would just say, all in all, insurance is definitely an area to watch here.
So we've been discussing drugs that are already in the market, whether they're being used off-label or not. What is coming down the pike in the diet drug space?
Yeah, a lot is the short answer. We've got, we talked about Lilly and Novo right now, right? But we've got 50 plus companies that have pipeline projects. And then there's another 50 that are just really early stage companies. And we really kind of break them into two categories. There are those who are pursuing GLP-1 based drugs, again, what Novo and Lilly have on the market. So that mechanism of action. And then there are companies that are pursuing, and some are doing both, pursuing other mechanisms of action. And so let's just start with this GLP-1 based group. Other big names getting involved are Boehringer Ingelheim. You've got Viking. Amgen's working on a once monthly injection. Meanwhile, Lilly and Novo are doing their own thing. Lilly's got a triple agonist, retatrutide. They actually published results at the American Diabetes Association conference in June. Very impressive, finding that the weight loss is even greater with this triple agonist than the double agonist. Again, Lilly's got the double agonist. Novo Nordisk has the single agonist. In both cases, this triple agonist from Lilly is proving to outperform in terms of weight loss, and the side effects appear to be no worse. And then also the benefit for blood sugar and diabetes is also superior for the retatrutide. So that's going to be an important development and will likely, just cannibalize Lilly's own business with the double agonist. But that's how all these drugs and companies work. They're always looking to put out the better thing. The next big category within GLP-1s is orals, right? So we talked about this being a weekly subcutaneous injection. Orals are certainly better for people who are needle phobic, but these would be daily orals, but they're also convenient. They don't require patient education, which is required for the injection. And when you're in a busy family practice, office, clinic, and you don't have much margin in terms of time and actually financial margin, and you want to keep patients moving through the door, to just be able to prescribe an oral is much easier than having to do patient education. So there's a lot of benefits for the oral. And we've got Lilly pursuing orals. We've got Viking pursuing oral. Pfizer, big name, obviously pursuing the oral. And so we'll have to see what happens. There's others developing orals as well, but those are kind of the big ones. So that's kind of the GLP-1 front. Let me just pivot over to the other mechanisms of action. There's a lot of them. I don't think we necessarily have to go through all of them, but the key thing is these other mechanisms of action could solve some of the GLP-1 shortfalls we talked about, like better tolerability. So could we eliminate some of these GI issues? Could we maintain the lean muscle mass? Could we have longer duration? And we've got AstraZeneca pursuing Novo, Lilly are pursuing these other mechanisms of action, and then a lot of other names as well.
Finally, let's talk about how obesity drugs are disrupting or could disrupt other business models. For example, very recently, Jenny Craig, which is a kind of a diet lifestyle chain, went into liquidation. What do you think about that specific area of the effect of these drugs?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I mean, this is just one of those times where you've got an innovation, a technological innovation that disrupts not even within their own industry, but outside of their own industry. And that is why, another reason everyone's talking about these. So yes, you've got the Jenny Craig example. Weight Watchers recently purchased a telehealth company so that they could start prescribing the GLP-1s themselves directly. They obviously recognize the threat to their business model. Other companies within healthcare, we've got sleep apnea devices are kind of cited as potentially at risk from these drugs. There's just a high correlation between obesity and sleep apnea. So we've got companies like ResMed and Philips that make CPAP devices. There are also companies like Inspire and LivaNova that make neuromodulation devices that control sleep apnea. So there's been a lot of questions about, how at risk are these companies? Other things like bariatric surgery, that this is kind of commonly recognized as being at risk. And some have even speculated that these weight loss drugs could make bariatric surgery obsolete altogether. Things like cardiovascular stents and statins could be affected. Again, we'll just have to see how effective these drugs are and how long people stay on them. But that's kind of the hope, that some of these things do become obsolete. insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitors for diabetes patients. Those are often cited as under pressure by these drugs, or could be. Obviously, as people are able to control their weight, they're less likely to get diabetes, or if they have diabetes, it becomes much more manageable with these drugs, and they may not need to be regularly monitoring with a continuous glucose monitor. And then in case of an insulin pump, actually the insulin pump injects the insulin automatically. So those would be two areas. At the same time, I don't think we can call for the death of diabetes devices at this point. It's still a huge market. It's still underpenetrated. They're making new advances all the time, eventually moving toward a full closed loop system where it's just happening automatically. So I would not write those players off at this point, but it's an interesting tension that we'll need to be watching for. So those are kind of some losers. Here's an example of, how Stream can add a lot of value. We had one of our Stream experts, a plastic surgeon, talking about a potential winner from these drugs. And this plastic surgeon was saying skin tightening procedures are anticipated at his practice to increase. And so, makers of these skin tightening, minimally invasive technologies are InMode, Cutera, Bausch Health. And it wasn't something I had thought of before, but in reading that interview, I think it will be really interesting as people lose weight, tighten up their skin, and generally just feeling better about themselves. I think even beyond specifically skin tightening procedures, I think we're going to see lots of people taking care of themselves, feeling better, investing in themselves as they lose weight and improve their health.
Sara, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nick. It's been a pleasure.
Today we spoke with Sara Stahl, who leads the healthcare coverage at AlphaSense Expert Insights Solutions. We covered the new class of diet drugs, which is probably the major topic in pharmaceuticals this year. This was another episode of Signals by AlphaSense. My name is Nick Mazing. You can find us on all the major platforms. Thank you for listening or watching.
Thank you for joining us. This was another episode of Signals by AlphaSense. Keep in mind that all views presented here are the views of the guests and hosts and do not represent the views of their employers or of AlphaSense. Nothing in this podcast constitutes investing, tax, legal, or medical advice. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and review, and subscribe for more.